Hello all, and welcome back to Talk Nerdy to Me, a show that we've just realised we may need to rename, because apparently it's a rather popular title on YouTube. So here's something you might find interesting. I made a very long editorial video on the question of whether or not there should ever be a female Doctor Who, and it was terrible. Everything went wrong with it, which is why this one is a little bit late. It is absolutely unviewable. It is appalling. It is the worst thing I ever made. So here's a clip. She kind of took herself out of the running when asked about it and said, "I'm not going to be the first female Doctor Who. No, 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 absolutely not. I absolutely wouldn't contemplate that." Ouch. I mean, that's the kind of no that even Robin Thicke can understand. And that's all of it that will ever be seen by human eyes. So, it was very important that I cobble together something so we can keep these releases going. So I thought, what's wrong with a nice top 5? So, in the spirit of the show, in its fledgling stage, these are my top 5 nerdy films that were never actually made. In the long history of genre cinema, of fantasy and sci-fi, there are times when the great works are very almost made. And the films that we know and love today would have been very different if the people who originally put in to make films had had the chance to do so. Development hell often swallowed up these poor lost souls, and now many of the filmmakers are dead, or the franchises have been and gone and are unlikely to be remade, certainly never in this way. So these are the top 5 lost franchises, the films that could have been. This list is rated by probability, so number 5 was something that was purely a whisper on the wind. It was never really considered, whereas number 1 was something that was so close if just somebody had made a totally different decision. And you can imagine how it works for the in-between films. So, get your purely hypothetical popcorn in hand. It's time for a little bit of speculative cinema history. Number 5. Here's something you may not have known. There was a time when Tim Burton wasn't shit. I know. There was a time when he was one of the great visual directors. There was a time when he wasn't a self-parody. And there was a time when he would cast people other than his wife and his best friend in his films. This is what we call the glory days. And following his successes with his 2 Batman films, Tim Burton was one of the directors who entered a bidding war against Steven Spielberg for the film rights to Michael Crichton's novel Jurassic Park, which Spielberg obviously won. And the rest is history. But can you imagine, just for a moment, if Burton had won that bidding war? Just let that sink in. In terms of speculating what that film would have been like, all cards are off the table because, as I said, at this time Burton wasn't a self-parody. There would have been no Johnny Depp, no Helena Bonham Carter. There would almost certainly have been a Danny Elfman instead of John Williams, but what are you going to do? So try and imagine Jurassic Park as anything other than a spearhead for new special effects and a new way of filmmaking, because almost certainly Burton would have just settled for claymation. While I am a huge fan of stop motion, don't get me wrong, Jurassic Park was the film that changed the field. And I can't help but wonder that if Burton had got that film, it would have ruined it, and we would only now be starting the great CGI renaissance. But I would still have loved to have seen it. I really want to know what that film would have looked like. But again, it was only ever in a bidding war, and that's why it's at my number 5. And I can't really talk about much about it because it was just a whisper on the wind. Oh, shit, there would have been no Bob Peck. No Clever Girl, no Samuel L. Jackson. Fuck it, it would have been shit. Number 4. Now, I don't know how many of you have read the Book of Revelations, but one of the signs of the coming apocalypse, apart from like the coming of the comet, the dragon rising from the deep, is Peter Jackson makes a film that isn't an adaptation of something else. That's not to say that I don't love Peter Jackson's films, I really, really do, but he is kind of the master of adaptation at the moment. And sure enough, since time immemorial, he's been trying to make a film of Halo. And it's kind of drifted through those rusting gates of development hell. That's why it's so low on this list, because there's still a chance that it could happen. Now, I'm not a gamer. I've never played Halo in my life. I think I've watched other people play it, but that's about it. The scope and the size of it, I can fully appreciate why Peter Jackson is the man who wants to make this film. I get it. It's a very cinematic game from what I've seen, and he is the man to do it as far as I'm concerned, even though probably you have a cast purely of people bound up in space armor. Really, I'm not a gamer. They'd probably all be played by Andy Serkis, let's be honest. And that's not a bad thing. That is not a bad thing at all. Again, this is fairly low because there's still a chance it could happen. Last time I checked, he still owns the rights to it, and there's still quite a bit of a pre-production has been done and is sitting in a file somewhere in Weta Workshop, I imagine. So if it does happen, I really think he could have a science fiction franchise on his hands to rival the fantasy franchise that he's already got under his belt, which name I can't really remember. I don't think it was that successful, to be honest with you. So yeah, this is the only one on the list that is still a watch this space. Peter Jackson's Halo. The best science fiction film that might one day be made. It's not going to happen, is it? Number 3. This is going to be the last one for the first part of this video because the top 2 require a whole video to themselves because they're really rather exciting and meaty to talk about. But this is my personal favourite on this list. In the late 1980s, a few film companies wanted to make a film out of Doctor Who. And one came very close, so much so that a few props were made, quite a bit of concept art, even a draft of a script that is now lost in the mists of time, and they cast their lead actor. They cast somebody to play the Doctor. Now, this was in 1987, so on TV, Sylvester McCoy had just started playing the role. But the film Doctor was going to be Dudley Moore. Doctor Who, the movie, starring Dudley Moore. So many emotions on that idea. Now, the thing that leaps immediately to mind is the fact that if you have famous quasi-supernatural character here suffixed with the movie starring Dudley Moore, you'll start to think of Santa Claus, the movie that starred the Big Lebowski. That film has become a cult classic. Now, it was probably awful at the time it was made. It was pretty god-awful when I started watching it at the age of 4. But now it's a cult classic and it's loved for its campy value, and I can't help but think that that is exactly what Dudley Moore as the Doctor would have been like. But he was a bloody good actor. This is the thing we forget. Not only was he a remarkable comedian, he was a really, really good actor. Arthur would never have worked if he couldn't have acted. Bedazzled, the proper one. These are films that would never have worked if he hadn't been able to act as well as be funny. So, what on earth would Dudley Moore as the Doctor have been like? I really, really want to know. I would have loved to have seen that film. It would undoubtedly have been better than the Peter Cushing ones. And here's the problem. Peter Cushing, under any other circumstances, would have been a fantastic Doctor. The films he was in were not good. Dudley Moore, seriously, just say that to yourself. If you imagine the kind of fantasy and sci-fi films that were made in the 1980s, you can begin to imagine what Hollywood Doctor Who would have looked like. You can imagine the music, you can imagine the sets, you can imagine the monsters, and I think it would have been absolutely wonderful. I think it would have been camp. I think it would have been loud and brash and nonsensical, but Dudley Moore's the Doctor. My God. Actually, the more I think about it, it would probably have looked an awful lot like the film Excalibur. Leave that with me. There might be a video about what that film actually would have looked like. Well, that's it for part 1 of this top 5. In the next part, we're going to have a look at the top 2 geeky films never made. Can you guess what they are? Well, you don't need to, because only about 6 people watch this, and you were all with me in the pub when I said what they'd be. But still, tune in next time. Toodles.